State-owned enterprises, they face fierce competition from private firms, but at the same time, there are also advantages that state-owned firms can have over multinationals. Some countries are welcoming investments by sovereign wealth funds. As I mentioned, these funds are patient investors, so they are not under pressure to exit in order to receive short-term financial returns. So they take a longer term strategy on their investments.
Hello and greetings. This is Professor Ravi Sarathy, and welcome to another episode of International Business Today. Our podcast seeks to feature current issues in the world of international business that are of considerable importance to academics as well as to managers and executives in multinationals and in globally operating firms. Today, my guest is Dr. Anna Grosman. She's a professor of finance, digital finance at the Loughborough University in London, the UK. And she has a very strong background in finance. Before she became an academic, she worked in mergers and acquisitions for a number of firms in the corporate sector. Georgia Pacific, for example, Koch Industries, Citicorp, and similar organizations. As an academic, she heads the master's program in digital finance, and she also does research in a variety of issues, most recently on state capitalism. I have Anna here with me today because I want to talk to her about state capitalism and state-owned enterprises. She received a PhD from Imperial College London. In addition to teaching at Loughborough in London, she's also been a visiting professor at EDEC in Paris and at Bocconi in Milan. And most recently, she was in Australia at Curtin University in Perth. We are delighted to have her here to hear her talk about her research and views on state-owned enterprises and content from her new book, Handbook of State Capitalism, published just a few months ago by Oxford University Press. Anna, I'm delighted to have you here with us on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for the invitation, and I look forward to our discussion.
I'm going to start off by asking a simple question which could be of great interest in setting the stage for our audience. Based on your research and experience, what is your definition of a state-owned enterprise?
In my work, I broadly define state-owned enterprises as companies with direct or indirect state ownership. And this level of government involvement can be at different levels. It can be at a central government level or federal, regional, or municipal. So there are different ways that the governments can own state-owned enterprises.
So, who are the key stakeholders in a state-owned enterprise? I ask that question because, generally speaking, a firm has to create a strategy, set goals, which are influenced by its stakeholders. So, for a state-owned enterprise, who are the key stakeholders?
I would say that for state-owned enterprises, the key stakeholders are owners of state-owned enterprises and their representatives, such as boards and managers. In the case of state-owned enterprises, the chain of ownership is quite long. So when you think of it, while the governments, they control the share capital, but they do so via the involvement of government officials and civil servants. But they also do that on behalf of citizens of their country who are the ultimate owners. So this chain of ownership can create conflicts of interest between the different types of principles.
So you're saying that stakeholders set a SOE's strategy and goals, but they may not completely agree on these goals and strategy.
Absolutely. And that creates, those complexities that state-owned enterprises experience relatively to privately owned firms, for example.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question, actually. How does SOE, typical SOE's goals and strategy, differ from, say, a Western multinational such as Microsoft or IBM or Total in France?
So there are significant differences in goals between state and private-owned firms. So private firms are designed to maximize profits, protect shareholders' rights, also manage their operations sustainably and ethically. These goals also apply to state owned firms. However, they might differ in the relative importance of these goals. But in addition, most importantly, state owned firms are charged with achieving non business goals. And such non business goals include, for example, employment generation, industrial policy, innovation, protection of intergenerational wealth, and also, for example, diversification and stabilization of the country's economy, and some kind of diplomatic influence. So you can see that the goals by which state owned enterprises have to function are more diverse and to some extent broader than those ones of private firms.
So, would it be correct to say that these differences in goals and strategy would affect the way that a state owned enterprise would compete with a multinational when they're competitors in the same industry?
Absolutely. So the SOEs, so state-owned enterprises, they face fierce competition from private firms, but at the same time, there are also advantages that state-owned firms can have over multinationals because they focus on these broader sets of objectives. One example would be to say that because state-owned enterprises don't necessarily follow financial objectives to the same extent as private firms, and that's because they are being financially propped by the governments. What we say, they have soft budget constraints. This can also confer to those state owned enterprises a high level of trust from financial investors, resulting in a greater propensity to invest in them. And it can also provide them with a greater resilience in times of economic downturn, such as what we've seen with the 2008 financial crisis, when some financial institutions were partially nationalized to stay alive.
So, for example, a state owned enterprise might prefer to cut prices in a recession in order to maintain employment and market share, as opposed to a private sector multinational, which may not be able to do that because they need to worry about rate of return on investment and shareholders in a public stock market. Would that be, for example, a kind of difference in how competition might evolve between SOE and a multinational?
Yes, absolutely. So, that goes along with another salient difference that essentially is around the type of government investment, because governments are what we call patient investors. So they pursue strategic goals that go beyond profit maximization. And that allows state owned enterprises to undertake projects that are initially unprofitable, but for the sake of longer term strategy, such as investment in R&D, innovation.
So let me ask you, given that you've been researching and studying state owned enterprises for some time, how have these SOEs changed, let's say, over the last decade or so?
So I think that overall, we see those boundaries between global state owned firms and multinationals becoming more blurred, in the sense that governments are no longer passive owners, totally uninterested in performance, but there are other active shareholders that are seeking increasingly multiple objectives. So, for example, sovereign wealth funds, they can target strategic industries such as infrastructure or technology, and they can be used as part of government's external investments. So you can see that the governments are becoming more strategic in terms of where do they invest in which kind of industries, but also geographically, how do they expand beyond their home markets.
Mm. You brought up something very interesting, the home market. Clearly, SOEs have to balance paying attention to their home market versus going overseas. So, can we talk a little bit about how SOEs maybe get some advantages when they compete against other private companies, including multinationals, in their domestic home market?
So naturally, state-owned enterprises have a special treatment at home. So they have no budget constraints, and they also benefit from other valuable resources that belong to the state. So they do have an advantage at home, especially in situations of monopoly. But there's also this other side of the coin, in the sense that these very advantages also make them less competitive abroad, as they may lose some of the state influence in foreign markets. So you can see but the other side of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we switch from the home market to international markets, all companies have the liability of being a foreign company when they try to go overseas. So, can I ask you, what are your thoughts about SOEs going overseas in terms of how they go about going into overseas markets? And then a sub question, given that the government is a critical stakeholder, how much does the government affect or influence the overseas expansion of a state-owned enterprise?
So I think that the factors that drive SOE's expansion in overseas markets depend on the country of origin of those state-owned firms. So, for example, state-owned firms from strong institutional and democratic regime are likely to go abroad in pursuit of business objectives, as in the case with the German automobile firm Volkswagen's global expansion. They would behave similarly to private multinational. So if you are a state-owned enterprise from another type of regime where the role of state might be more important in the economy, then of course the factors that drive SOE expansion would be different. Why do why do state-owned enterprises go abroad? Well, this also depends on home countries' institutions. Often, this foreign expansion into diverse industries abroad can reduce the dependence on home country institutions or on some particular sector at home.
Now, one of the big questions that comes up when a multinational goes overseas is their impact on the country that receives them. For example, what do they do to local competitors? How much do local consumers benefit? Do they increase employment and wages in that country, etc.? So, can you tell me how state-owned enterprises affect the countries they enter, and is it any different from the way a private sector for-profit multinational would affect those recipient countries?
No, I think that this is fundamentally very different.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of interaction between the recipient and the sender country is very important. So, in going abroad, the government owners can pursue different types of objectives. So, it depends on the type of orientation of their strategy. So whether that's inward looking or more of an outward looking strategy. And also it depends on whether the goal for this expansion is more towards economic orientation or social orientation. So I'll give you some examples. Let's say the government can use state-owned firms to spread its ethical and social values to other countries. In this case, that would most likely be democratic government in market-oriented state. So in this case, we can see, for instance, the Norway's sovereign wealth fund is being used as a tool to spread social and environmental practices through their investments abroad. But then there is also a different types of strategy where the governments can try to use state-owned enterprises to achieve supremacy in other countries. So again, it's a kind of an outward-looking strategy, but it's more of a economic goal. So this would be characteristic of interventionist countries with authoritarian regime. So Russia, for instance, could use some of its state-owned assets to invest in certain countries, but not in others that are, in conflict with its present regime. And then finally, we can also look at inward strategies. So how do state-owned how are state-owned enterprises used by their governments via their international investments to reinforce the kind of social standing or the economic standing at home? And one such strategy would be a developmental strategy where the government would use state-owned firms to facilitate its own country's development. For instance, Indian government would ask some of its state-owned enterprises to buy the strategic assets abroad, and that was the case in the instance of lithium and cobalt resources that India did not own, but that were needed for the development of the electric vehicle market. And then finally, the governments can play a recognition strategy. So this would be helping them to build a standing within the region, but for more of a social objective. So, for example, they could invest in other countries via state-owned enterprises to improve their country recognition by other countries. And that's the case in the Middle East, for example, with the United Arab Emirates state-owned enterprises. So we've seen some of their investments in each other's countries.
Now, when you talk about this issue, I'm reminded of the Chinese government's Belt and Road Initiative, which seems to me a perfect example of the kind of issues you've just raised. The BRI is intended to help the recipients with their infrastructure, but at the same time, the BRI is intended to improve China's ability to influence these governments and to also increase the revenues and profits of Chinese companies, infrastructure companies that can get contracts to deliver on the infrastructure loans that have been made. So I guess the question that arises is, do all state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds have the same approach, or do some of them most strongly favor making the national interest paramount, whereas other countries, such as, say, Norway, might, as you point out, be more interested in helping the recipient country develop in the social and economic arenas. Would that be, a way to dichotomize how SOEs look at countries that they want to invest in?
Absolutely. I think the way the governments are using these state owned entities really depends on the attitude of the government towards its economy. So whether so it goes beyond the kind of the political regime and the level of the institutional development of a country. It's really more fundamental, whether the government, decides to build the strategy of state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds around internationalization and influence through those entities, their strategies, and indirectly have a role in other countries' economies, or whether the government's attitude to this is more of a, I basically treat these entities in the same way as private multinationals, so I let their managers, run their businesses completely independently, and I just, collect the dividend. So this is an approach that some of the governments have taken with their, state-owned multinationals like Norway. But of course, there are other countries that have a more direct involvement in their strategies, and therefore have this kind of discrete power through those entities over the countries in which these entities are investing.
In international business, we often talk about the image of the country of origin. For example, cars from Germany are generally thought of as well engineered, or clothes from Italy, very high fashion design, etc. So what is the image of state-owned enterprises abroad when they leave their home country and go overseas? Is the image of a state-owned enterprise generally favorable, or are there some negative connotations attached to simply being a state-owned enterprise in a foreign country?
It's a great question. I think the short answer is that it depends on the country of origin, and also on the foreign country where this state-owned entity is entering. For some companies, such as the car manufacturer Volkswagen or aerospace multinational Airbus, we do not even realize that they have a stake by the government. But on the other extreme, we have companies such as Huawei, which is officially not a state-owned company, but is perceived as one due to its strong political connections to the Chinese government. It really depends on the country from which the state-owned firm is coming from and how it is perceived in the host country, in the recipient country.
Anna, you've brought up sovereign wealth funds a couple of times. Yeah.
After a pause, because you, so the after a pause, if you can ask the question.
Okay. The question that I want to ask, Anna, is about sovereign wealth funds. You've brought up wealth funds a couple of times, and I think my question is, are sovereign wealth funds different from state-owned enterprises, or are they the engine, primarily investment engine, that drives state-owned enterprises' expansion both domestically and internationally?
So they're different types of entities, and they also have slightly different strategies. So they are essentially mechanisms for governments to manage excess wealth for future generations. So they are created as stabilization and commodity funds, and they are investing the proceeds from natural resources, exports, foreign exchange, to ensure that future generations will benefit from this accumulated wealth. So their design, their strategies are fundamentally different, yet if they are used in coordination with state-owned multinationals, they can drive the government's agendas in the same direction.
Anna, let me ask you a question related to these wealth funds. Why do governments use sovereign wealth funds to expand overseas, as opposed to other governments using these windfall profits to invest in domestic agendas to improve the social welfare of their population?
Yes, that's an excellent question, Ravi. I think it depends on the orientation of the state, whether that's long term or short term orientation. If we take the example of Norway, their sovereign wealth fund is about $1 trillion. It's the biggest fund in the world, and it's nearly 3 times bigger than the Norwegian economy itself. And it's worth about 140,000 pounds for each citizen. But current generations are unlikely to see this money during their lifetime. So you can see that the Norway's government orientation is very long term, whereas other countries that have not even set up a sovereign wealth fund, they may use some of the oil windfalls, for example, to improve the fiscal policy, reduce corporate tax. And so these are probably governments that are more short term orientated, because the effect of those policies are seen immediately by the present generation. So this is one reason, but of course it also depends whether the government is already involved in the economy via other means. So if the government traditionally has a big state-owned sector, then it's much harder to take out the money from state-owned enterprises and to invest that money in setting up a sovereign wealth fund. And the only country that does both successfully is China. And usually the countries would go either for a big state-owned enterprise sector or a sovereign wealth fund.
Now, it is clear that an SOE answers primarily to its home country's government and other key stakeholders to ultimately improve domestic welfare. But supposing we switch the perspective, how can the country that receives these state-owned enterprise funds manage that entry so as to improve its own domestic economy? So let's say, I'm in South Africa or in Kenya and I'm receiving SOE funds from another country. What policies can I use to make sure that I am benefiting my own country, whether it's Kenya or South Africa?
Well, I mean, some countries are welcoming investments by sovereign wealth funds. As I mentioned, these funds are patient investors, so they are not under pressure to exit in order to receive short-term financial returns. So they take a longer-term strategy on their investments. And yes, I mean, they do bring some kind of financial stability to the country. And indirectly, I think the investments by sovereign wealth funds indicate an affinity between the regimes, between the country of the fund and the recipient. So
Now,
that can only strengthen, the diplomatic or bilateral relationship. They should already be quite strong, to be honest, to start with, as the case of, let's say, China investing in Kenya.
Now, in strategy, the general purpose of strategy is to dominate a market. You want to be number one. You want to have the highest market share. Ideally, become a monopoly, or at least an oligopoly. So my question is, Do state-owned enterprises work in cooperation with their wealth funds, sources of capital, to focus on specific industries and try to dominate that industry globally, get leading market share and high profitability from their industry focus? So would you want to comment on that?
I think we need more research on that topic, but we see anecdotal evidence where state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth fund can jointly invest or even disinvest from a particular industry or a particular country. So, as in the case with China, we see an interest in investing in energy outside of China, due to lack of internal resources, and that investment can happen uh, in continental Europe, for example, either through sovereign wealth fund or a state-owned enterprise, state-owned multinational. So we definitely see this coordination effort, which I think should be more examined in future research in terms of coordination strategies.
This has been a fascinating conversation. So I want to ask, if you will, a last question, which is, are state-owned enterprises here to stay? Will they continue to be part of the global economic environment for many decades to come? And therefore, a multinational from a Western country must, as part of its strategy, think about it, that I will be competing with the state-owned enterprises, and I therefore need to have a strategy for making sure I compete effectively with them. Would that be a sort of natural conclusion to draw from all of the work you've been doing on this issue of state capitalism?
Yes, I strongly believe that state-owned enterprises and state-owned multinational is a growing phenomenon. So these state-owned entities are increasingly venturing abroad. So they will be over time becoming true competitors of multinationals, and sometimes unpredictable in terms of their strategies and the next moves, because they have those interesting agendas that go beyond market market or business objectives. So this is going to be an area that private multinationals are going to have to strongly examine in the future. And I think increasingly state-owned multinationals and funds are becoming at par in terms of their strategic orientation and in terms of their performance with multinationals, private multinationals. So they should not be seen as these, large bureaucratic animals that are just the extension of the state. So they should definitely be taken seriously.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's really a fascinating perspective. I know you've written extensively on this topic. You have a new book out on the Handbook on State Capitalism from Oxford University Press. And so I hope that those of you in the audience who found this chat about state-owned enterprises interesting and want to learn more will take a look at her book. And Anna, thank you for your time and patience in answering my questions. And it's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Ravi. And yes, if you are interested in learning more about state capitalism from a variety of perspectives, I have this fantastic handbook with Oxford University Press on state capitalism and the firm. So there it is. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too, Anna. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.